I think Head Start is our way of talking to people and sharing some of our insights.
When you're in the foundational stages of your career, not always do you have access to senior folks, right? So think of this as like we want to make sure that we are that coach and mentor.
Perhaps that role may not be the right one for you, but it's so important to actually, and in the book we have this framework called the push-pull matrix, right? So figure out the reasons in terms of, what's pushing you versus what's pulling you.
We have a framework in the book called Learn, Do, Share, and Teach. And the whole idea there is obviously if you're in an enterprise environment, personal learning can no longer be personal.
And again, if you think about a career lasting for 40 or 50 years, it's so important to be able to try and at least know why you're making certain decisions and how are you making those decisions. And that, I think, is the purpose behind what we were trying to do here.
In the book, we've obviously differentiated between having a mentor, having a coach, having a sponsor, and almost like a personal advisory board, right?
And you shouldn't have to wait for a crisis before you have to make some of those changes in life. And in the book, I talk a little bit about a personal health crisis that I went through, and I talk in the book about how that was probably the best thing that happened to me in my life.
Hello everybody, welcome to Talking Through. Today we have two fabulous guests on our show, Vivek Gambhir and Sunder Ramachandran. Welcome to the show. And before I go any further, I would like to congratulate on your book, Head Start. And I've personally read it. It is fantastic. And I think with passing time, a lot of people are going to come to you and say thank you because they're going to find it helpful. And thank you for coming to the show, taking out time. Thank you so much.
Dipankar, it's a pleasure. And I think getting an endorsement for someone like you, a young leader, I think means so much, because in some ways it actually implies that the job we set out to do is reaching the right audience. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dipankar, and we're really looking forward to this conversation today.
Thank you so much. To be honest, it's quite a fanboy moment for me because whenever I meet authors and people who have done such great work in their careers, it's always a fanboy moment for me. So, but before I go any further, I just want to ask you one thing. In between all your commitments, both professional and personal, how did you take out time to write a book like this?
I should be asking that same question to you, Dipankar, right? We were chatting before about, the way the commitment you have, and along with Rahul on the podcast, which is actually incredible. I think honestly, for things that we love, we always find the time. I think busyness is probably an excuse in most situations, and when you can find a wonderful, partner to do this with, it actually makes it all the more fulfilling. And so I think we never even worried about not finding the time. Once we had decided we wanted to do something, I think luckily it all fell into place. But again, having a partner to do this with actually just makes it a lot more easier, I think. Yeah.
Oh, great.
No, absolutely. I think like Vivek said, right? I mean, one is if you're aligned on the purpose of why you're doing. So if the why is clear, then of course pathways open. But I think I also fully believe that, as professionals, we've been in the business for many, many years now. So I think over a period of time, you also develop rituals. You have a better awareness of how do you balance your priorities and how do you really maximize time. Right. So I think to that extent, doing this at a slightly later stage of our career gives us a little more leverage in terms of being in control of, knowing ourselves well, knowing when we are at our productive best. And that sort of really accelerates the process as well. So.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think a lot of people are going to find inspiration from this, right? Let's talk about Head Start now, which has been in the market for a while now. What is the message you're trying to give?
Honestly, it's the stuff that we wish we had known when we had started our career. We are privileged enough to have had, a decent run at a career, but along with, all the learnings that we've had, we made so many mistakes, I think, Dipankar, in some ways. I think Head Start is our way of talking to people and sharing some of our insights in terms of what it takes to actually not only set yourself up to succeed in the near term, but also to pave the way for a thriving career, which for most of us will last for 40 to 45 years.
Sunder?
I think, one of our key messages, Dipankar, in the book is not all mistakes are worth making yourself, right? So, obviously we've made a lot of tactical errors in terms of how we've navigated our careers. And we hope that, people can learn from that. So really it's our attempt to codify lessons we've learned from some of the errors we've made. And then, of course, we are also encouraging young leaders to go and make their own mistakes, right? Learn from us, but then obviously go express themselves, try their own experiments, make their own mistakes, and then, really go from there. But really our hope is, when you're starting out, when you're in the foundational stages of your career, not always do you have access to senior folks, right? So think of this as like, we want to make sure that, we are that coach and mentor, and the sounding board that's available to somebody who's, let's say, 2, 3, 4 years into their career. And, how do then they lean on our expertise and experience to really give themselves a head start? And that's really what was the big motivation behind, writing this book.
Which actually brings me to another question. What difference do you find starting back then when you started and now? What do you observe? What is the real difference now? Is it becoming more complex or is it becoming simpler?
I think, first of all, the kind of opportunities that people have today and the kind of careers that are around today are things we could never have dreamt of. When we started our careers, things were actually quite linear, right? There was always this pressure on climbing the proverbial ladder. And in some ways, I think our risk taking abilities were a lot more calibrated. I think in today's world, what is amazing is the kind of opportunities that the current generation has, which is amazing in one sense. But along with that, as you were saying, Dipankar, the kind of challenges, the complexity, the volatility, the pressures of social media, the pressures on mental health, right? Other macro situations like, what's happening today with climate change, etc., makes the world far more complex. And so, therefore, on one hand, you have lots of opportunities. On the other hand, the ability to actually be able to figure out what success means and how to be far more deliberate about preparing for a career and making wiser choices, that is getting far more complicated than I think when we were starting out.
So people are also spoiled for choices, but then there's so much complexity around it that you don't know how to navigate it through, right?
And that's where we hope the book helps, because a little bit is about this compass or a guide to help people actually prepare themselves better and understand the framework in terms of how they can make better choices. And again, if you think about a career lasting for 40 or 50 years, it's so important to be able to try and at least know why you're making certain decisions and how are you making those decisions. And that, I think, is the purpose behind what we were trying to do here.
I think also, Dipankar, the demands that, like Vivek said, right, the environment has changed significantly, right? So even if I take the lens of just about the last 20 years, right, I think that the markets become super volatile. Right. So, I mean, I started out in 2003, which is, not very long back, 22 years, right? But it was still at that point reasonably certain that, if you come out of B school, join a good quality company, unless you do a disservice to yourself, you could have been reasonably rest assured that you'll have at least a decade long journey, right? You can't say that today, right? Even if you're good, I mean, obviously there could be a restructuring, there could be an environmental change, there could be a business model disruption that may place companies in awkward positions. So I think the agency that people need now to own their skills and to maintain their currency and to be relevant, I think that pressure, I feel, is a lot more pronounced today than even just 20 years back, as an example, right? And I think that's going to be the tone as we go forward. And I think that's where, again, the book, right, just to talk about that, is to really be able to be that agile learner, right, who could sort of remain relevant, be a good journeyman, journeywoman, if you will, right? Because as much as you may not necessarily have the opportunity to be in one company for 10, 20, 30 years, even if you so desire.
So true. And as Sundar was saying, I think, Dipankar, I think fundamentally the employer-employee contract has changed, right? 20, 30 years ago, I think generally the expectation was you do well, you stay in a company, you will be there for 10, 15, 20 years, and in many cases you would retire, right? But today, given the volatility, I think loyalty is at an all-time low. And loyalty needs to be a two-way street. All employers get very frustrated saying that employees are not loyal. But guess what? Our employers being equally loyal about it, right? And to me, I think fundamentally, because the entire employer-employee contract is changing, and that's why you hear all these things about, quiet quitting and all of these ghosting, etc., right? But there are reasons, because the fundamental contract and the relationship has changed. So the onus is far more on the individual today to be better prepared, to be able to figure out different options, because you don't know what direction your life can take you. You might be performing very well, and suddenly that company might, force a layoff, and you might lose a job. Those things are very difficult to control, just given the volatility, right? So the onus is far more on individuals to take charge of their careers than when we were starting off. The expectation at that time was much more that the companies will take care of you. I think today, while you can hope that the companies will take care of you, the onus is far more on the individuals to actually take much more control of their own careers.
Right. And I just wanted to share a personal story. I started in 2008, probably the worst time to start.
Crisis, right?
Right. And I was reading the book and I was reminiscing that time when I started, which I was like interviewing from one job of the other, and none of them were clicking. And I then realized that whatever little long-term mindset I had helped me go through those, troublesome times. But at the end, the kind of skills that I got going through, those troubled waters, not very, stable environment, that helped me later, because then the fear was gone. Like anything can happen, right? So I think that really helped me. And I was reading the book, and especially, the chapters on, be a marathon runner and those, and it was like really striking me that, if I had read this before, it would have at least given me more mental peace that it's going to be fine later.
Also, I think the point around skills, right? Skills being the real true currency today, right? I mean, classic example of what you've been able to create, right? This is in a way you're building a certain muscle, right? Whether it's podcasting, whether it's writing a book. I think it's also thinking a little bit about how can you extend your relevance beyond just over-indexing on, let's say, a particular employer. Given, like Vivek said, the contract itself is sort of in an interesting place right now. You don't want to park all your eggs. I think the whole portfolio approach to finance, you need to sort of apply that in a way to your careers as well. I think that's a smart way to look at careers now, and I'm sure it's going to be evolving and changing even in the next 5 years, as an example.
So I mean, that brings me to my next question on the chapter you've written on avid learning. And there was this very interesting concept about extrinsic and intrinsic learning. Would you want to explain us a little bit about it?
Yeah, and the idea of extrinsic and intrinsic came by with a colleague I work with. His name, he didn't want us to use his name, and so we used the name Tejas. And Tejas started off, again, very high pedigree, went to some of the top schools in the US, Ivy League University, worked for a few years, then decided to become a monk, right? And spent 1 year being a monk, and now he is again in investing. And the way he talked about this was, look, you need a reason to learn. Not all learning can be pure joy. And so the best way to think about learning is to have the fuel to get started, which can be very intrinsic. And the intrinsic part of learning is about developing curiosity, developing an ability to read. But then there have to be some extrinsic reasons, which are all about perhaps, getting promoted, finding a different job, or changing industries. So in some ways, you have to find the right balance between intrinsic reasons to be motivated to learn, but it just can't be learning for learning's sake. It has to be learning in an applied context. And I think this is where I think Sunder's framework, which he developed, around, LDST Sunder.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think, we have a framework in the book called Learn, Do, Share, and Teach. And the whole idea there is, obviously, if you're in an enterprise environment, personal learning can no longer be personal. It has to, you getting better has to result in your teams getting better. If you go through a leadership development program, it has to result in you showing up better as a leader, and the judge of that is your people, right? Your teams, or you becoming more productive and therefore producing better business outcomes for whatever context you're in. So the idea of the whole LDST framework is, as you upskill yourself, you got to have a mechanism and rituals to be able to really socialize that learning and extend that impact beyond just n is equal to 1, right? And the way you do that is, obviously you've learned a skill, your toolkit or what have you. You need to find a meaningful way to share that within the organization. So whether that means, putting up a blog on the company website, or, most companies today have some sort of an internal social network or an enterprise social network, talking about it there, doing a lunch and learn. So you're not limiting your know-how to yourself. And then finally being able to teach as well. Yeah, because the best way to learn something is to teach it, right? So partner with your HR, L&D teams and become a coach, mentor, trainer on that particular subject matter, as an example. So if you think about it, not only do you create a cadence where you are going deeper into whatever it is that you're getting better at, but you're actually creating value beyond yourself. So our encouragement to all young leaders is, indulge in a lot of personal learning, but with a very, very clear view that you don't want to limit it just to yourself. Right. And that then becomes a force multiplier. And in a way, again, going back, it makes you stand out. Right. That gives you a head start in your career, because people see you as someone who's thinking the bigger picture beyond just getting better yourself, right?
And also, to this point, I just wanted to ask you about the emerging technologies that are coming, like AI and machine learning. And there is a sense of opportunity with a lot of people, but there is a sort of insecurity also in some people that we're going to fall behind. What's your message that how can this be handled?
Look, we've seen different waves of technology impacting us, whether it was the advent of the personal computer, then it was the advent of the internet. And so every 10 or 20 years, we've seen major transformations enabled by technology. I think AI is one such big transformation, which I think will probably have a very significant impact. And in some ways, I do feel that, at least in India right now, we probably are underestimating the impact that AI will have, particularly in middle-level jobs. Especially, if you think about AI beyond generative AI into more agentic AI, which can totally transform workflows. That's what middle managers do a lot of, right? So I see the impact probably is going to be far more significant. Having said that, I think the key will be is for all of us to learn how to embrace AI. We can't deny it. It is going to impact every single role, every single job. And so we need to find a world which is both human plus AI. And there are three aspects that I think are important as you think about AI. One is this whole approach around interrogation AI. Do you actually know how to ask the right questions? So you need to actually learn how to ask AI the right questions. The second is judgment AI, which is all about AI will not always be right. So can you actually exercise more human judgment while working with AI? And then the third part is what we call reciprocal apprenticing, which is as much about training AI while you're learning from it. I think you have to combine these three things, but it's so important for all of us to be able to learn how to leverage AI and use it for our advantage, because you don't know how big AI can become. It is going to be transformational, but the impact only time will tell. What we owe it to ourselves is to be fully prepared and be able to master AI as much as we can to be far more productive in what we are doing today.
I think, one of the practical ways to look at it, I mean, very difficult to obviously crystal gaze and say what more will happen, right? But I think the good news is, if you look at most AI platforms, there is a consumer class version available already of everything that we're using in the enterprise, as an example. So as an individual, how do you build fluency? I think the simple place to start would be to say, hey, you know what, how much are you integrating the use of some of these consumer applications that are already out there, backed by large language models, in stuff that you do? Whether you write, whether you create posts, whether you do visuals, whether you do planning, I think so much of that can be integrated. What that will do is get you a sense of comfort just as a consumer, right? And just as it happens in marketing, there's obviously a spillover. right? And spillover happens from the world of consumer into enterprise, not the other way around usually.
Right.
Correct? So if you've played around with these platforms, in your personal space, when it eventually becomes a force multiplier in the enterprise space, you're not overwhelmed. You start developing an appreciation for, yeah, I mean, I get it, right? And I get the corporate context, I get the enterprise context. So I think that is a straightforward approach, because otherwise we can have a lot of conversations about AI. It can become a very intellectual subject. But if you don't sort of break it down and say, hey, what's my personal play? And start very, very simple, right? Then you can sort of building it one brick over the other, and give yourself a chance to stay relevant, upskill as the enterprise starts more adoption at scale and things like that. So those are easy places to start.
And I just wanted to take this opportunity to ask you both, like, at the CXO level, at that strategic level, what is the sense with this technology? Do they think this is really going to be very transformative very quickly, or it's going to take its own time? It'll come, but it's going to take some time.
I think I'm sensing that people are unsure at this stage. They know it's important, but a lot of CXOs and boardrooms are still relegating this more as an IT agenda. But the forward looking CEOs are looking at thinking about this. This needs to be a CEO driven agenda. This is not a CIO or a CTO driven agenda. I think because the impact of AI can be as much in HR, finance, operations, sourcing, marketing, product development, etc. But the forward looking CEOs are looking at the transformative impact and are embracing this as a significant board level agenda. But today, at least, I don't see too many boards. They're asking questions, but it's getting down to a few isolated use cases. A lot of AI use cases tend to be in tech support, voice telephony, customer service. But to me, that's the generative part of AI. But the minute you start looking at more agentic AI, it can impact every single part of our operations. I think the onus is on, first of all, boards to learn about AI. The CXOs to actually learn about AI first, because unless they fully appreciate the implications, the takeaways, the potential impact, I think you will end up probably looking at just being a very ad hoc piecemeal approach. So most companies today are asking questions, experimenting, but I'm seeing the forward-looking companies are actually thinking about this being a critical driver of transformation and truly making it a CEO and a board level agenda.
I think in conversations I'm having, Dipankar, I'm finding a little bit of what you call the cart is in front of the horse effect, right? So,
Yeah.
and you're a classic consultant, so it's a fundamental strategy question, right? Are you creating a strategy for the market, or are you finding markets for your strategies? I think that's where AI is, right? Like, it's not uncommon at all at senior levels to have a conversation to say, hey, what is our AI strategy? Right? Wherein, it's just a tool. Your strategy is your strategy, right? It's a business problem that you're trying to solve. I think that's where we are. Everybody wants to have AI because there's a little bit of fear of missing out. But being super clear about what is it that you're trying to do. And I think we're all sort of, the market's actually shaping the AI thinking within companies, right? So typically we'll have in all the functions that Vivek said, all big companies will have SaaS providers, right? And suddenly the SaaS will have an AI bolt on top of it. Right? And then we'll go with that to say, oh, you know what, now your software platform also does this, because now it's AI enabled as an example. But how much of ground up is happening, how much of value stream integration is happening, I think still early days, but eventually we're all going to get there, right? I mean, just look at the impact. Like I said, the impact this is having on us personally, just as individuals and consumers, that itself is profound. So it has to flow through to businesses and enterprises.
It's sometimes I feel that it's like a shock jolt out of your comfort zone.
Right.
That you were doing things the way you used to do, and suddenly there's this other thing that you need to integrate with your work, right? So that's at least that's my own experience. Yeah.
And one of the examples that we've mentioned in a few other places, right? So one is the core difficult enterprise business problems, right? But even in things like coaching, mentoring, I mean, you're seeing full play. I mean, a classic example that I've mentioned before is, Marshall Goldsmith was the well-known coach, right? He's got now an AI platform developed by Fractal Analytics in India. It's called marshallgoldsmith.ai. So, now for no cost, every single person or young person can have Marshall Goldsmith at their disposal, right? Because his AI avatar, and that's trained on everything that he has said and written and spoken, da da da. You can have a direct conversation with him on video and ask him questions, and there he is giving you answers. So that's just today. It's already available now. This is going to get even more refined, better, contextual as time flows, right? So we're in an interesting space right
Sundar,
now.
perhaps we might need a head start AI version
Eh,
now also, right?
absolutely.
So, giving us ideas here.
Now there is an AI version for everything.
We should have our own avatars here, in the metaverse, talking about head starts now.
I can do a podcast with the avatars.
Exactly. You don't need guests anymore,
That's actually, I think that's a path breaking idea.
No, but I think it'll happen sooner than we think, right? So,
And also, it's very common to feel this, that you're stuck in a career, in a role, in a designation, in your sense of responsibilities. And there's lack of growth opportunities sometimes, How do you deal with that? Like, what do you recommend?
So look, I think it's happened to all of us, right? We're still in the middle of fairly active career. So in a way, our advisory is coming from the place of we're sort of flying the plane as we build it, right? So all of this applies to us as well, right? I think it starts with awareness. So really, the fundamental question to say, why are you stuck if you are? I think that's number one. Second is, as much as possible, how can you internalize this versus externalizing it? Because typically when you hit a roadblock, the immediate tendency is to look at alibis. Hey, look, the company is political, boss is not working out, I'm not in the right industry, maybe it's my role that's the problem, it's not configured correctly, so on and so forth. I think our advice is, all of us have a lot more agency than we think we do. Right? So I think the starting point is to say, hey, what can I do differently to get unstuck?
Right.
Correct? What practices can I incorporate? How can I consider showing up differently? If softer skills, often it's behavioral, right? If you've had a reasonably successful career so far, safe to assume that you have the cognitive horsepower to do the job that, you've been tasked to do. Maybe there are some elements of stakeholder management, there are elements of relationship, the elements of navigating, can't understate any of this, managing up. That's an opportunity where you may seek some coaching. I think the other thing I would say is asking for help. One of the mistakes we've made is, not asked for help early enough. And we're hoping that, young leaders don't make that mistake. If you feel stuck, don't wait an year. Reach out, ask for help, and it's totally fine. And, you may suddenly find a new pivot, you may find new perspectives. That sort of opens up new directions for you. Yeah.
And just to build on what Sundar was saying is, it's very important to demystify what stuck means. Because sometimes we externalize the problem, as Sundar was saying. And one of the advices we give to people is, please update your resume every 6 months or 1 year, right? Go through even if you're not looking for a job, because when you start updating your resume, and if you realize you really haven't advanced over the last 6 to 9 months in terms of new skills, perhaps you might be plateauing and not learning enough. Second is, if 3 days out of a week, you don't really feel like getting out of bed and coming to work, or over a 3 or 4 or 5 month period, you're just feeling loss of motivation, lack of engagement, or you're working for, a boss who's not fully appreciating, who you are. If you're not getting the right signals from the organization in terms of your progression, these can all probably be leading indicators which might potentially point towards getting stuck. And as Sundar was saying, first of all, look within yourself and say, is it actually me, or is it something which I can't control? And to the part you can control, try that. Ask for feedback, ask for a role change, ask for a stretch assignment. And if after all the effort you've made, perhaps that role may not be the right one for you. But it's so important to actually, and in the book, we have this framework called the push-pull matrix, right? So figure out the reasons in terms of, what's pushing you versus what's pulling you. It's so important to put a little bit of systematic approach to trying to peel the onion and try and look at what exactly being stuck is and why are you feeling that way.
Right, right. And also, it's a very globalized world. So you just don't work with people who are in your region or in a country. You work with so many people across the world. So once you see people making progress and you're not doing it, it kind of spooks you, right? Whether I'm on the right road or not. So I think that's a very prudent advice, that update your resume. You'll know whether you're growing or not, right? Yeah. So and when you also mentioned stretch assignments, sometimes I feel we don't take it because we have this innate fear of failure, right? That fear that failure will not be taken in the right spirit, right? So how, I mean, I don't know how to deal with that. Can you share your experience on that?
So look, I think that has to be a core ingredient, right? I mean, you're not gonna get to a strong career without a few bad quarters, right? Or a few bad years, actually, right? So if you think about it, it's an essential ingredient. It's not something that you suddenly embrace because it's happened, and I think it's important. So right when you're starting out, you have to have that recognition early, and this is where you need to take a leap of faith. This is where coaching, mentoring comes in, so that when eventually you hit a patch when things are not working out, you find lack of momentum, and it could be many reasons, right? You basically are able to stay calm and say, a bad day is not a bad career, right? I think one of the big lessons that we've learned in failure is the ability to sit with your bad days and not go crazy, because you're going to get many of them, right? So when that happens, the ability to sit peacefully with it and say, it's not working out right now, but things would get better. Because otherwise, if that's going to drag you down and you're going to go into a rabbit hole, that's going to come in the way of you showing up in the best way that you can. So the one of the big frameworks in the book around which all the sections are built is what we call be your best self at work. So you're not reserving your best. You don't want to get into that mindset to say, hey, you know what, I'm going to become this X title. I'm going to get into this position and then I'll show the company what I can bring. And we show it today. So the behaviors come first, and then the title, trajectory, the leadership, everything else follows, right? So that's a good way. And I think, it was actually Vivek's encouragement and recommendation that we really looked at the last section. I think you made a reference of it at the beginning, the marathon runner. It's a very difficult lesson to appreciate and understand when you're 25 or you're 30, but it's probably the most important lesson, that this is going to last 30, 40 years. So if you have that context, and we are still coming to terms, I mean, I still often get short-sighted, right? So, but you have to keep pulling back, and Vivek keeps suggesting, hey, it's a long run, right? If you keep going back to that perspective, I think you're able to calibrate yourself and say, I mean, fair enough, right? I mean, not everything has to happen next quarter or 6 months. So what if it happens a year later? So there's no race. You're not early, you're not late. I mean, you're fine.
I think Sunder said this very well. Look, ultimately, all of us learn best when we are uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And that's the essence of a stretch assignment. But Dipankar, it's also very important to be able to do this in a psychologically safe place, where, as Sundar was saying, whether it's an organization or a boss who allows you to make mistakes, right? And it's important because you can't say, I'll sign up for a stretch assignment, and then if I don't do well, then the consequences are disastrous for that. So you have to have safety along with this ability to say, I want to be uncomfortable because I learned a lot. The other important part is, figuring out what your sense of identity is, right? And your identity is far more, universal than one bad experience. A lot of times we get very hard on ourselves, and if you don't do well for a couple of years, you're not a loser. You're still a good person. You still will have a successful career. But it's so important to preserve your sense of identity and who you are, and try and separate that from the day-to-day successes and failures both. Because sometimes we get too swayed by both the highs and the lows. We do something great, we think we are heroes, and we take all the credit ourselves, right? Something doesn't go right, we blame the environment, right? It's so important to preserve our sense of identity in some ways, and not get too swayed by both the highs and lows we'll all encounter in our lives.
That's actually quite a prudent advice from both of you. And I think a lot of us can actually inculcate that in our day-to-day life, whether professional or personal, actually. I mean, in the stages of your career, you must have mentored so many good professionals, right? And so I just want to learn from you a little bit of the art of mentoring and receiving that mentoring. What's your experience says?
So I think, look, in the book, we've obviously differentiated between, having a mentor, having a coach, having a sponsor. And also we recommend that, people actually widen their consideration set and think about having almost like a personal advisory board, right? Which is a consideration set of all of these type of individuals, right? I think in terms of giving it, our recommendation to leaders would be to be a lot more generous with their time. That's number one. Number two, don't always walk in with the assumption that people need advice or people need coaching. Sometimes people may just need a little bit of sponsorship. They may just need a push. They may want you to be a matchmaker, find you a right role. All of that is great sponsorship. All of that is great mentoring as well. So it doesn't always have to be about you showing off your knowledge to somebody else, right? I think that's the other piece. On somebody who's receiving it, the classic feedback we've got from a lot of young people is, how do I find a mentor? Yeah. And I think labels sometimes are not very helpful, because obviously then they get confused. Oh, is she a mentor? Is he a coach? I think the simple way to look at it is look at role models. Yeah. Who are the people in your immediate environment, in your ecosystem, who deliver something to excellence, right? You see somebody delivering a presentation and you're like, wow, I wish I was able to articulate my point of view that way. Just drop a note to that person showing your appreciation for what they just did and what you saw, and ask them, hey, can I get 20 minutes with you? I'd love to understand, how did you get to where you are today? What do you read? What do you consume? How do you practice your craft? Because obviously there's a process they follow. Excellence just doesn't show up like that, right? That's a simple, straightforward way to start. So a great way to build a relationship or seek a mentor is to look at role models, appreciate the role models for something very specific that got you in awe, got you impressed in the first place. And you will notice that, at least our experience has been, most people are very, very generous. I think the challenge is, a lot of the younger professionals think, oh, I can't reach out to the senior person because, why would they find time for me? 90% of the time, that's untrue. I think leaders are more than willing, because it's almost like Call of Duty, right? I mean, why are we where we are? We are here where we are because obviously so many other leaders have been generous to us. So it almost becomes a Call of Duty to pass it forward, and that's what we'd love to do. So all the young folks who are who are watching this episode, I mean, just write to the leaders in your company and you'd be pleasantly surprised that they'll be more than happy to spend time with you.
Correct. And Dipankar, you asked the question about the art of mentoring. I think there's a science to mentoring as well.
Yeah.
It is very important too. So, and the science of mentoring is all about cultivating relationships. And so knowing who the right mentors are and ensuring a productive relationship. The onus is far more on the mentee. Mentors need to play a part, but the mentee needs to make sure that, first of all, if you have a mentor, please tell them, formally, will you want to mentor or not? Obviously there'll be lots of people who can be sounding boards. Yeah. But if you're truly serious about getting a formal mentor, actually reach out and define some ways of working in rules of engagement. So how often will you meet the mentor? What kind of topics will you discuss? After the meeting is over, will you send them a message thanking them and capturing the key takeaways? Will you start the follow-on meeting again, recapping what was discussed before? A lot of this is very basic communication management, but sometimes we tend to falter when we think about effective mentoring relationships. And so our advice is, along with the art of mentoring, which, both you and Sunder talked about, it's so important to get the science of mentoring also right to get the most out of the relationship. Because, if you treat mentoring as a more sporadic kind of an event, the mentor will lose interest, because most mentors are again trying to figure out where to allocate their time. So unless you start, dealing with this in a more systematic, structured manner, most relationships end to just, erode over time, I think.
And if there's one trick that we want to give all young folks who are watching is, if you ever get into a mentoring conversation, never finish the conversation without asking the golden question, which is, how can I help you?
Yeah.
Right? So this assumption that it's a one-way street is actually wrong.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of value that a mentee can add. Not only does it show a lot of self-assurance and confidence, in a very practical way, there could be things that the mentor may be looking at, and say, hey, you know what, I'd love it if you can actually take this off my plate, as an example.
That's a
right?
great point.
So that's a great way to, expand Vivek's point. I mean, what better way to solidify the relationship than actually adding value back to your own mentor, right? So I think always finish the conversation. What can I do for you, or how can I help you, is a great question too.
Yeah, actually, this has happened to me unintentionally.
Yeah.
There was a person who was mentoring me and was very gracious, and just out of the blue, we were having coffee, and I just asked him if there's anything that I can do for you. Like, I'm just very junior. And he told me, I have an Excel. Do you know? Like, I need some help with that. I was like, fine, that's what my forte, and I'll get it done. So,
But that shows a great relationship where the mentor felt safe enough to actually, and vulnerable enough to be able to ask that
Yeah.
question to you. That's a good sign in terms of, how your relationship had progressed
Yeah.
for both of you to actually think about more as partnering
Yeah.
as opposed to a mentor-mentee relationship, I think. Yeah.
So I mean, it was very, it was wonderful for me, and I think it also helped me balance myself out a little bit. I just want to ask Sundar a question. Tell us about your appreciation tracker. It was such a wonderful thing that I read.
No, I think it's, again, it goes to the basic tenet of, trying to have rituals, right? Because obviously, philosophically, we all know that we got to give a pat on the back, or a positive stroke, as we call it in psychology, right? But again, if you leave it to happenstance, then it'll happen, it'll not happen. So the idea here is to say, as managers and leaders, we're all trained to do things in a proper way, but we're also trained to look out for where people are making errors. Yeah, we're not trained to really look out for folks when they're at their best. So the appreciation tracker is that, which is to basically say, hey, if you're a manager of teams, can you have a ritual and say, every week I'm consciously looking for it. I'm looking for reasons to appreciate my team members or my colleagues, and you will find many. And then being very specific about it. I mean, it builds confidence. I mean, we've all had experiences where we're having a bad week, when we think the world's going to come to an end, and suddenly, as we are wrapping up, we get this one wonderful email from the boss or the client, and the whole temper of the week changes. That's the power of well meaningful nudge appreciation. So why don't we use that to our advantage? And this is not, you're not trying to be artificial. You need to find a very specific reason for which you can provide that positive nudge. And when done so, it builds culture. Every company wants to create that. It builds stickiness. We all want to work for bosses like this. Yeah. And I think it builds that whole engagement within the company, right? So that's the whole idea of the appreciation track.
Right. Okay. Since the topic of bosses have come up, I want to ask you the $1 million question, which is how to be a boss magnet.
Go ahead, Sunder. Yes.
Yeah, look, I think, so the way we think about it, and again, what we've learned is, this is not about being artificial. Right? No psychofancy, no hyperbole. The idea here is to do three things. I think one, be able to identify what's value, right? What is the value? Because the boss has a mandate, right? She's a human being as well. So one is to identify what is going to create value for her and the enterprise, deliver that value, right? Simpler said than done, because even the act of identifying value is not intuitive, which basically means you got to ask the questions. How many people even ask their bosses, hey, can I look at your goal sheet for the year? Can I look at what are your top deliverables? Right? It takes a certain level of self-awareness and confidence to even ask that question. And then look at that document and say, hey, here are my goal sheets. How am I contributing to this story? Right? Have that clarity. What is the overlap, so to say? The second is to be able to capture that value. What that means is organize around it. So once you know what's value, how do you capture it? How do you report it? Right? So because you got to signal it as well. And the third is, the human angle. I mean, as we say in the book, the boss is a person just like you and me, right? So how do you build any relationship? It starts by fundamentally understanding who is this individual, what are their good days like, what are their bad days like, right? What excites them, what doesn't. That takes time to build. And if you invest in that, so if you do the hard part of understanding, delivering, signaling value, and you do the soft part of understanding this person, so you can cut them a little bit of slack, right? If they're having a bad day and they're not showing up too well, that's all right. You're not suddenly going to judge them too harshly and say, oh gosh, I'm going to check out on this person, right? That just balances it. Because, do keep in mind, you're not going to be at your best every day. So you do expect that accommodation from the boss as well. So it's mutual. And I think then that respect develops over a period of time. So that's really our way And we're using really the boss magnet as a hook to say, you do that well, you're valuable to the company, to your boss, but you're also having that human to human relationship, right?
Right. And to this point about human that Sundar is mentioning, and the appreciation tracker, which again, Sundar's been really good about putting into place. I think it's so important to also appreciate your bosses.
Yeah.
They are human, and ideally
Yeah.
try and do it in front of their bosses.
Yeah.
Right? It's not about sucking up. If you
Yeah.
feel genuinely, authentically that this is something a boss has done well, why not at least also, express your gratitude and your appreciation. And look, at the end of the day, we sometimes forget that our bosses need us as much as we, need them. And we have the power to actually influence that and shape that relationship. Because if you work with great bosses, it becomes an amazing, stint for you. And if you work with a nightmare boss, it can be hell. So to the extent you can, I think it's so important for us to try and exercise whatever influence we have to try and make the relationship as productive as possible. I think using the tips that Sundar has suggested.
And I've worked with some great bosses, and some of them are like spectacular people. And it also, motivates me to be a better boss when I get a chance to, right? So it's also a motivation for you to adopt those principles, to appreciate people, to get them going when it's needed. So it's also a good remembrance for you, right?
And you learn
Yeah.
both the things you should be doing from a great boss, and you also learn the things you should not be doing from a terrible boss, right? So,
Yeah.
I mean, I remember with a couple of bad bosses, I say, okay, when I grow up to be a more senior leader, I won't do those things, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I also, while I was reading the book, I also saw this thing about engaging your emotions, which I found very interesting. Could you please also explain it a little bit?
So I think, the whole point around engagement, right, which actually relates to both working in teams and also managing up, right? We often, if you think about the corporate narrative, right, it's a one-way street. It's almost like the responsibility of the organization to sort of almost hyper engage you, employee engagement, this and that. I think it's again a two-way street. There is employees have agency as well to engage, find meaningful engagement within the context in which they're operating, right? So that's really where it is. If you're not feeling connected to the cause, if you're not feeling connected to the organization, to the value system, to the purpose, I think the first question to ask is, what did you do to engage yourself into that particular process, right? Did you go deeper, or are you expecting some sort of an HR intervention that will suddenly drive that? So again, the whole essence of Head Start, Dipankar, in a way is, you are, take the wheels, right? You're in charge. Don't wait for somebody else to come and spark the fire, right? And I think to that extent, whether it's emotional engagement at work, there's a lot that you can do to drive that. There's a lot that you can do to get involved, and you must do all of that. And then of course the organization has its part to play and contribute as well.
Right.
And look, the fundamental principle which I think is so important is treat others the way you want to be treated. And I think it's so important to keep that always always keep on remembering that we'll all have good days, we will all have bad days at work. There will be occasions when we lose our control, right? The key is, how do you deal with those situations? Are you aware? Are you willing to apologize for a situation that you could not end up controlling? Are you going to learn from it? Are you going to be vulnerable? Inherently, we're all very emotional beings. And so we'll all express our emotions one way or the other. But to the extent we can keep some values in mind, such as respect for each other, trust, and recognize our mistakes and learn from that, that's how we'll all grow as individuals. And I think it's so important, because a lot of people say keep your emotions in check. For some people it might be easy to do that, for some people it might be actually harder to do that. But being able to recognize your emotions, what brings out the best in you, what brings out the best in your peers and your teams, figure those out and then actually deploy your emotions in a way that actually lifts the entire organization as opposed to bringing everyone down in the organization.
Right. And also, is sometimes when you're passionate about something, you wear a heart on your sleeve, and sometimes your emotions get the better of you. So it's hard to always keep your emotions in check. But obviously, if you need to apologize, then you need to apologize. Uh, and I did another very interesting thing in the book is that you have a Ubuntu symbol tattooed on your arm.
Right? Where is it? There it is, for the camera,
Why is this so close to your heart?
I just, to me, Ubuntu is such a wonderful way of expressing I am what, because of what we are. The sense of the collective. None of us actually work or operate in isolation. And sometimes, we all think from a very individual perspective. But ultimately, if you think about it, also, most successful companies have winning teams. They have great team members who are all working together. So how do you foster teamwork? How do you foster the sense of community? How do you foster the sense of strong connections? At the heart of it is this recognition that we are just one person. The collective is where magic truly happens, and I think Ubuntu is probably the best way to describe that feeling. I think, yeah.
Great. That was probably one of the most interesting things I read in the book. And receiving and also giving feedback is, I think, both an art and a science, as you also mentioned. But what are some of the good things to do with feedback, right? In your experience?
So I think on feedback, Dipankar, most folks who are watching are probably on the receiving end of it, right? But rather than at a stage where they're giving it. And some of the practices that we've seen that work really well, I think one is just walk in with a fairly open mind. So you're sort of absorbing what is being told. The other good practice is actually when you finish the conversation, just like you would capture minutes of meeting, right? Send out a quick note to your boss or to your mentor who gave you that feedback and say, well, you're paraphrasing. Well, this is what I'm taking away. This is what I took away from this conversation. List down those 3 or 4 bullets. I think that's a great way to show commitment to your leader to say, hey, you know what? I actually heard you. I'm playing it back to you. Tell me if I need to add anything else. And then also have a structure depending on, what juncture, what life stage of the year the feedback is coming in. If it's an annual feedback, then I think you want to take it a little more seriously and say every quarter I'm going to report back and say, you said these 3 things, this is what I've been trying to do. What of this has gotten better? Right? Asking so that, you have meaningful touch points and you can actually turn the feedback that you receive as a tool to have structured engagement. Otherwise, if you think about it, checking in with your bosses can be awkward, right? But now if you have feedback, you have a valid, it almost gives you legitimacy to say, hey, you know what? I want to talk to you about the feedback you gave me 3 months back because I've been trying a few things and I just want to see if things are actually getting better. So absorbing the feedback well, playing it back, showing commitment, reporting your progress against that feedback. I think those are simple steps, but you'd be surprised 80% of the people don't even do that. Right? It's almost like, you hear it and then you're gone, right? So if you just translate it, you're sending a very strong signal about your seriousness to act on it. And I think you get taken a lot more seriously by the person giving the feedback as well.
Yeah, I think feedback is honestly the best gift one can give to ourselves. It's such a critical tool for growth. Unfortunately, most people don't recognize that. Understandable because we all tend to be very very defensive, but it's so important to be hungry for feedback. And both of us suggest the one word you should not use in a feedback session is but. And what you should only always say is thank you for the feedback. This is not about you trying to present your side of the story, right? Feedback needs to be one way, right? You can have a separate feedback session to give feedback. But when you're receiving feedback, the most important thing is to learn, to absorb, listen, and then try and apply it. If there is some contrary views you have, don't say it then. Listen to the feedback and later on you can follow up with another session or an email. Because if you start getting into defensive mode, then we stop listening. We get so much more focused on articulating our point of view that the entire purpose of feedback gets actually lost.
Right, right. And I just wanted to ask you about career transitions, because as professionals, we are doing a lot of things and we are in a certain flow. But there comes a time when we think that there's a need for some change, right? How do you navigate that water? Because it's not easy, right? So, what kind of opportunities and how we should look for an opportunity? When do we think we should actually pull the plug on what we're doing right now? Uh, Could you please help us?
I think in the book we say the starting point of a transition is to actually think about link it to learning, right? Because the why is important, right? I mean, why, what might be happening that may necessitate a transition is the first fundamental question, right? Is it just that you're getting bored? I mean, you getting bored is not a healthy enough reason to just transition, right? Then you need to sort of find more ways to engage yourself. But I think why we are pointing back again to learning is we have a concept called the learning cycle, right? Which is when you are extracting value out of the work that you're doing. As a metaphor, you're building muscle in terms of skill, new areas of knowledge, so on and so forth, and you're also delivering value. So you're in that sweet spot, right? Where are you in that learning cycle? If you find that, look, you are at a point where it's becoming a little one way, where you're delivering because you've become good at your tasks, but you're not necessarily growing, right? You're not building new areas of know-how. You're not really building new muscles in terms of skill sets that you're picking up. That may be an interesting time to say, hey, you know what next? I think that's the first fundamental thing. And then, of course, you can layer it up and say, hey, that what next? Should that be internal? Should that be external? And we are recommending that you look at the landscape. Your current employer is part of that landscape. You don't want to get short sighted. You want to look at the landscape. And we have a frame in the book. We call it the 3-move plan. The idea is at any point in time, you think about your next 3 moves. And this is again not about crystal gazing. This is saying, hey, can you at least have a plan? Because the value of the plan is in the planning process, as they say, right? So just your ability to list down and say, what type of roles could be interesting to me in the 12, 18, 24, 36-month time frame? And more importantly, what capabilities could get me there, right? And what can I do to sort of build those capabilities? I think those are interesting ways. Otherwise, what typically happens, and again, that's a mistake we've made, is you think about transitions either when you're bored or when things are not working out, right? So I think when you're generally low, those are bad moments to make decisions. Right? Because you generally don't make good decisions, right? So if things are not working out with your boss, your first attempt is to say, hey, let me check out, right? Because I'm in a marketplace, there's obviously demand, so on and so forth. And we invest very little time in fixing it and thereby missing an opportunity without realizing that, look, there'll be other moments in your career when you may have a difficult boss and you've never built that muscle because you just kept checking out. Correct? So I think it's important to sort of sometimes embrace those difficult moments, work through them. Like they say, the best way to run out of a problem is to run into it. So sometimes you need to run into it, figure it out, build that muscle. And then if you actually feel that you've come to a logical end of a learning cycle, you've extracted as much value as potentially that environment, that opportunity presents, that may be a right moment to say, hey. And then, of course, as you make the transition, it may mean you're moving up or you're moving out or you're moving out on your own. That's the layering. But the fundamental pieces have to begin with, where are you in your learning cycle? And never, I think, like, for example, I've particularly made these mistakes where I've been in the middle of a very interesting learning cycle, but then I got attracted by something that came my way. Yeah. It looked very worthwhile at that point in time. But looking back, I realized, oh gosh, this 30-40% that I got, it didn't really make a lot of difference because nothing really changed dramatically. But had I been on that learning curve, probably I would have built a lot more muscle. So in retrospect, you get this point of view. And this is where, especially when you're going through transitions, having some sounding boards, not making those decisions alone, running it through a few well-wishers, I think all of those things really help.
Yeah, as Sunder was explaining, think about these as moves and not changes. Most people end up focusing far more on changes, but not in terms of moves. Because the idea of a move is to figure out, how does this fit into your overall narrative? Where will this get to you next? I think, is this a springboard for you? Is this a new industry that will allow you to get there? Is it a bigger role? So it's so important to think about this in terms of moves, not in just in terms of a sequence of changes. Too often I find people always believing that the grass is greener on the other side, and they keep on changing jobs every 2 or 3 years. And then all of a sudden you see a CV of a person, and the resume has, 8, 10 different
Mm.
jobs. And you really wonder, does this person actually have depth? Does the person actually have resilience? Or has this person developed only superficial level skills? And so I think sometimes making the moves can be hugely beneficial. It can be a very powerful springboard, but so important to do it for the right reasons. And while we are making moves, we sometimes underestimate the potential of and the opportunities that exist within the company as well. So sometimes lateral assignments, sometimes I think going to a different geography can be an equally important way to progress. The answer doesn't always lie in moving to a different company. Sometimes that's the right answer, but it's so important to try and first of all understand what kinds of roles could potentially be available within the company as well that could align with your aspirations and your goals.
And what I sometimes feel is when you're working in a company, you get aligned to a certain culture, right? So your bets of succeeding in something is when you're aligned to a culture. So probably it's always better to look in first and then look out.
Absolutely.
And I think we have a mentor who we've quoted in the book, and he said something very useful in the context of transitions, right? And he said, at any given point in time, somebody is leaving the company and somebody else is joining the same company, and both of them think they're making the best decision ever. Right? So in a way, it's also a little bit about perspective.
Yeah.
Because you may hate a company and then there's somebody new coming in thinking this is the best dream job type of a thing. So
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I think beyond the point, there's not much value in stressing too much about it. Right?
Exactly. Everybody has their own story, right? You've also mentioned about something we keep hearing is the go-getter mindset. How does one inculcate that?
The starting step has to be to nail your deliverables,
Yeah.
right? Ultimately, credibility steps from your track record. You may have the best degrees in the world or the best prior experience, but until you deliver, your reputation starts from the time you end up delivering. The first starting step is to actually nail your deliverables. The second part, though, is over time, it's important for all of us to figure out what we want to be known for. So when you are not in the room, how do people describe you? When there's a particular problem to be solved, are they proactively reaching out to you? When they need help, are they actually reaching out to you? And that's the idea in the book we call about becoming a linchpin. So how do you find ways to translate not just great delivery, but also start becoming far more indispensable at work by being both sought after, but also helping other people out. And in that sense, I think that's what a go-getter is all about, right? It's all about delivery, but also becoming a linchpin over time.
I think also, there's a little bit of lack of focus on execution, and I would take the blame, because sometimes we as leaders do that disservice as well, right? Fairly early, people start getting this feedback on you got to be more strategic.
Right.
I think all of us have gotten that feedback, at some point in our career, right? And that can be very esoteric. What the hell does it really mean, right? I would argue, and even if it's unpopular, the first 10 years of your career, I don't think there's really any need to talk about strategy. Right? Just focus on execution excellence. Because the big value in the first decade, at least, no matter what context, what industries is, can you get really good at getting the job done? Correct? Of course, you want to have the enterprise mindset. You want to have the ability to think big picture, but that's the leader's job. Sometimes the leader's inability to articulate the big picture manifests itself in feedback like this to say, hey, you be more strategic. And then it leaves the person confused to say, oh, really? Okay. So maybe I should take my step off the, execution, lever and start thinking strategy. I think execution in the early mid part of your career, just out execute. And we see enough examples. I mean, take any industry, folks who execute better eventually, win disproportionately. Right? That has to be the focus, and that's a fundamental ingredient of becoming this go-getter.
Yeah. And do you think success of some of the startups versus failure of some of the startups is actually ingrained in this a little bit, or is it something else that happens now?
I think, if you again look at, it's a journey, and there are different phases that one has to go through. As Sunder said, look, in the first few years, the focus is on execution. Next, the focus becomes on team leadership. Third, it becomes about connecting the dots and being able to integrate things. The fourth piece can be about influencing and much more strategic kind of thinking, right? A lot of startups tend to get stuck in one way of working because that's the only way that the founder is used to working. So being able to sense when to change and how to change is something which probably is the single most biggest challenge that each startup ends up facing. And when you are unfortunately under the microscope of a funding challenge, when you have investors to answer to, when you also have a ticking time bomb in terms of how much money you have in the bank, these decisions become even more important. Like, look, for a corporate that's very well funded, even if you make a couple of mistakes and delay these things, those things will not impact your survival. But when you actually are running the pressure of limited funding and you don't know how to try and navigate these shifts, that's when startups actually end up failing. It's all about not knowing when to build the right team, when to delegate a lot more, when to change your business model. I think those are some of the things which, again, many founders do not realize how to make those shifts happen. And that's when I think startups end up not succeeding.
Right. Also, you've spoken a lot about harmony, balance, resilience in people. How do you do that in such a fast-paced world, right? I mean, it's everybody wants that, but does it really happen?
Well, I think it happens. It takes time to figure it out. That's the one thing I think. But there's value, as we've realized. I think there's value in having interests outside of work. I think Vivek spoke about not sort of having loose identities, right? Which basically means you don't want to put all your eggs in the basket of work, so that a bad day at work doesn't just translate into a bad day, right? It's difficult, right? But I think we all have to make intentional efforts. So if I just were to give advice to my younger self, I would have started the process sooner to say, hey, you know what? Can I find other pockets that fulfill my self-esteem needs, right? So that if I'm not delivering at work for one reason or the other, there are other places I can derive meaning from. That, at least I started very, very late in my journey. I would have done that sooner. So our advice would be, the sooner you can develop hobbies. And one of the things I'm worried about, like when I work with younger team members, all they consume by is work. They do very few things, and Netflix isn't a thing. Yeah. They're not really other activities or hobbies that they're actively pursuing that could fill up some of their buckets, right? I think it's important if you can, and that could be anything: sports, writing, podcasting, whatever, right? Different things for different people. But having that active set of activities, and then what you do there, how you show up there, also in a way shapes the way you show up at work. I'm sure you see a difference in terms of the kind and the quality of people you meet, and how that shapes you as a professional, as a leader. I'm sure that shows up in the way you show up at your organization, as an example, right? Or in your client relationships, as an example.
I think what we've learned is striving for balance is very difficult. What you need to try and figure out the right blend. And that blend may keep on changing at different phases of one's life. But it's so important to be deliberate and intentional about it. And you shouldn't have to wait for a crisis before you have to make some of those changes in life. And in the book, I talk a little bit about a personal health crisis that I went through, and I talk in the book about how that was probably the best thing that happened to me in my life, because it really forced me to recalibrate some of my life choices. And today there's been enough research that's been done on the impact of stress on mental health, right? So it's so important for all of us to figure out what works best for us. Again, the trap we shouldn't fall into is that there is a one-size-fits-all approach. Some people may actually be very happy working 80 or 90 hours a week, but for somebody else, the right answer might be 50 hours a week. I think both of those answers are equally right or equally wrong. We owe it to ourselves to figure out what that right blend is at that particular phase in our career, and then try and align our life and work choices in terms of what will give us that fulfillment and what will allow us to actually have a sustainable career over 40 years. Again, we have to remember that the careers are going to last for 40 years. So, how do we pace ourselves to have a productive, healthy career over such a long period? But the answer, I think, needs to be extremely, personal. I sometimes worry about the narrative becoming again a universal one size fits all narrative. We have to respect individual choices and allow people to nurture their individual full potential the way they want to be able to live their lives.
And can I also add, Dipankar, one of the things I've tried over the last few years, and that seems to be working, and I'm hoping to do more of that, is, Vivek spoke about this power of collective at work. I think the power of collective also works at home.
Very true.
Yeah. How can you sort of get people enrolled into whatever you're doing? Like, one of the mistakes I made is, not really talk too much about what's going on at work at home in the early mid stages of my career, and it was driven by the assumption that, they may not necessarily understand, how can I expect them to have empathy because they don't know the context and so on and so forth. And that was foolish on my part because I was underestimating. And one of the things I've seen give great results, which also leads to balance, is involve the spouses, involve even the kids, involve the parents, even if that means telling them what you're doing. Like in the book process, our spouses were very actively involved. They were kind enough to show up at some of our events and so on and so forth. I think that helps. Which is, it becomes sort of a family project of sorts, if you will. They are then able to demonstrate understanding and things like that. I think that just so young professionals can do it. I mean, get your spouses involved or get your parents involved. I think that power of the collective, because then they can give you that scaffolding, right? To really sort of build this journey together is something we shouldn't underestimate, would be my suggestion as well.
So, since we are coming to the tail end of this interaction, and I just wanted to ask you both my favorite question, actually. For our Gen Zs, for our favorite generation, do you have some 2-3 tips so that they can do great in their careers?
I think, the one thing I would say is it'll all work out.
Hakuna Matata.
It always does. So I think don't fuss about it too much. I think stay the course and, think really, get more interested in building your skills. Start making investments in yourself, right? I think that will have the biggest payout versus anything else. Don't try to get too clever, right? Just invest in yourself and you'll be fine.
I think each of you have such amazing potential, but live life by your own terms. Figure out your definition of success, and figure out your playbook one chapter at a time. Don't start worrying about what other people are doing or thinking, right? Successes are never linear, careers are never linear. The road will be very windy, as Sunder was saying. There will be lots of twists and turns, but enjoy the ride and figure out what success means to you and find out your way to be able to live your best self, as we talk about in Head Start. Yeah.
Gentlemen, thank you for coming to the studio, spending your valuable time with us, and enriching us in so many ways. And I'm sure whoever is watching will be extremely enriched with your thoughts and your ideas, and hopefully also read your book. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dipankar, for having us. We really enjoyed the interaction. Keep up the great work. And for the audience, please do pick up a copy of Head Start.
Thank you, Dipankar. I think you're role modeling much of what we're saying in Head Start. So we wish you well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. See you soon.